Hello and welcome to another Hand Drink Solo wine info video where we review curious wines for curious minds. And today's curiosity is a little bit of a curveball because today we're reviewing a supermarket friendly little brother of a wine from the Kanonkop estate stable. So to be clear, we are not reviewing the world famous Paul Sauer Bordeaux blend, and we're not reviewing the iconic Kanonkop Cabernet Sauvignon, nor are we doing the absolute history-making Reserve Pinotage. We are reviewing the Kadette Range Cape Blend 2016, and they make millions of bottles of this Kadette Range every single year. So why would a wine club that dedicates itself to wine geekery and unusual wines bother to showcase something that sits on a supermarket shelf every day of the year? Well, the answer to that is that sometimes the world's most enjoyable curiosities are hiding in plain sight. For those of you who have been with the Hand Drink Solo Wine Club for a couple of years will remember that in 2023, we reviewed the Kanonkop Kadette Pinotage 2013. This too was classic supermarket stock, and yet we opened this wine at 10 years of age and it absolutely blew our minds. And the positive feedback that we got from this video was incredible because it revealed a secret that really is good news for wine lovers everywhere, and that is that you don't have to be a millionaire to have a home cellar full of well-aged wine. The Kanonkop Kadette Pinotage 2013 proved that very clearly. There are two main mistakes that people make when trying to figure out which wines should or shouldn't age. The first is to assume that only the most expensive red wines can age and that white wines should never age. And the second is to assume that any old wine can age. What's interesting to note is that if you try and tap into the experience of a wine critic, you'll notice that the older and more experienced wine critics are ever increasingly reluctant to declare any categorical verdict on whether or not a wine can age, because predicting the aging of wine is not really science, definitely not accounting. It's more kind of jazz, and it requires a level of experimentation, which is why it's almost essential that any wine lover should take the occasional cheaper Wednesday wine and slip it into their cellar and forget about it for a decade just to see what happens. I've performed this deliberate forgettery on a number of occasions and have had some absolutely sterling surprises. Not least of all, the Strongfeld first sighting Syrah. I'm drinking the 2016 now. Also, Saronsberg's Seismic Bordeaux blend. Again, the 2016 now is tasting great. Of course, even in jazz, there are some musicians who are better than others. And so it is with trying to guess which wines would age. There are some guesses that are better than others. And at the end, I'll leave a link to an article and a video, both of which talk a little bit about how we can make better guesses when it comes to picking which Wednesday wine we want to sneak into our experimental aging cellar. But let's get back to the wine of the day, because it's no good me telling you it survived 9 years and 6 months. You need to get into the glass and taste it for yourself. So when we give this guy a sniff, well, I must confess that on opening, initially, there was a touch of alcohol and the fruit was a little bit tight, but within 5 minutes, it had totally opened up in the glass and we got a completely different scene altogether. So the first thing we picked up was some lovely ripe black fruit, and it is a 14% wine, so you shouldn't be surprised that there's beautiful notes of black plum, a little bit of prune, but then there's also the tasteful use of oak that comes in, bringing the balance of some oak spice, of cinnamon, a little bit of cedarwood. And this also makes sense because it has been in oak for up to 14 months. And finally, for me, the thing that elevates it beyond just being mass-produced red wine that has been aged in oak, there is this really interesting savory undertone, perhaps a little bit of tertiary, a little bit of forest floor leaf, but also sweet tobacco leaf that's underneath the sweeter fruit and the oak spice. So you have this beautiful mix of savory, sweet, and spice notes blending together on the nose. But let's give it a sip and see what it's like in the glass. Well, to make sense of what we're tasting, we need to know that, first of all, this wine is 40% Cabernet, it's 30% Pinotage, then there's a decent portion of Merlot, and then splashes of Cabernet Franc after that. So it's fairly classic as far as a Cape blend goes. What's lovely to note is that the structure is still very much intact. And again, if you have a look at the color, you'll see that there's only a little hint of bricking. On the palate, the black fruit, the kind of prune and even fig and a touch of plum carries through just as it did on the aroma. But that savory element that you just detected on the nose really comes to the fore. So you've got what is essentially a really classy mix of savory notes and fruit notes. And as we smelt on the aroma, a touch of spice, but it's not like a spiced orange preserve. It's perhaps more like a cherry preserve with just a little bit of cinnamon dashed in there. What's particularly encouraging is that it's not all preserved fruit. There's actually fresh elements as well. So you've got this tartar, juicier cherry element. It still feels quite fresh. And so that keeps the mouth watering. It offsets the slightly sweeter notes and really provides a kind of third element that balances the savory, the fruit preserve type element, and then the beautiful fresh black cherry note that zings through the middle of it all. And again, we are lucky enough to detect some beautiful tertiary elements. So some of that fruit almost feels like a dried fruit, like a dried plum. And then some of the oak notes present as a more sort of antique cedarwood type element to it, which is really lovely. And that's the joy of aging wines. There's this thought that you want a wine to last 20 years and it must still taste as fresh as the day it was bottled. But that makes no sense. There's no point waiting if it's exactly the same as it was 20 years ago. So what we want is some of those notes. If there's a floral note, it shouldn't be fresh. It should perhaps be like a dried rose petal. Or instead of being a fresh plum, it might be a dried plum. And we definitely get touches of that on this wine. Also, prune note is something that is classic to Pinotage. So even after 10 years, you're still getting those varietal cultivar notes coming through in the blend. Sign that a wine is very much alive, still holding its identity, but having shown a little bit of extra tertiary joy, and that's why we age them. And perhaps if you want to get just a little bit philosophical, the beauty of tertiary notes in a wine is that they cannot be faked. It's not something that you can add a little chemical here or there legally. But you just have to allow time to do its work on a wine that was made well in the first place. And so essentially your Wednesday night wine experimentation may require a little bit of faith in order to reach that little bit of magic. So now that we know what it tastes like, I thought I'd just give you a little bit of a background on the Kadette range. The first vintage was bottled in 1985 under winemaker Beyers Trutte, although it was in fact the owner Johan Kriger's idea to have this range that could house grapes, or at least wine, produced from vines that were a little bit too young to go into the reserve range. So originally in 1985, the Kadette range had a blue label, and this made sense because it was supposed to be separate from the reserve range. But about 10 years later, they realized that they were dramatically over-delivering on this Kadette range because it went through all the exact same winemaking processes, fermented in these big concrete coper that the reserve ranges were made in, also matured in oak. And so they felt like actually the estate range had the esteemed cream label and the Kadette range had a blue label. They thought we need to have both Kadette and Kanonkop under the cream label. Now, marketing experts everywhere would have cried, "Oh, confusion, brand cannibalization. It seems like a terrible idea." And yet, 30 years later, from the switch to that cream label, Kanonkop is an absolute icon, arguably the most well-known South African wine brand in the world. There are millions and millions of bottles of Kadette drunk every single day. And as for the reserve range, it's showing absolutely no sign of suffering as a result of the Kadette range having the same label. So if nothing else, this wine is a curiosity, at least in the sense that the pure marketing of it is totally counterintuitive. The end result is that both Kadette and the Kanonkop Reserve range seem to have raised each other to the point where the presence of mind in the consumer for Kanonkop is arguably greater than any other. So while you pour yourself a second glass, I'm going to leave you 3 links, one of which will only be on the Hand Drink Solo website, and that'll be linked through to an article that I wrote on how to guess whether a wine will age well or not. And then I'm going to leave links to 2 videos, one of which goes into the history of Kanonkop and just lists the sheer number of giant personalities that have shaped South African wine. And the other talks a little bit about Strandveld, which is the estate that produced arguably my greatest Wednesday wine experimentation, the first sighting Syrah. Until next time, drink niche and stay curious.